Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our first colloquium. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Henry Fisher, who comes from Clerkenwell Heath. I've known Henry for a while. Henry did his he did a DPhil in medicinal chemistry, Oxford, obviously, DPhil. And then he went to work for the Beckley Foundation, which lots of us are familiar with. And then started a drug policy think tank, Volkswagen. Where we worked on some kind of related things, and then has done various things in the psychedelic space. Most recently, Henry, with others, has set up Clerkenwell Heath, which is a kind of organisation that runs psychedelic clinical trials. So I don't know what you're going to talk to us today about. I imagine it's something around that. So
I'll tell it.
Thank you, Henry.
Brilliant. Hello, everyone, and thanks in particular to Celia for inviting me to speak at this colloquium up here. I'm Henry. I'm Chief Scientific Officer and one of the co-founders of Clerkenwell Heath. And I'm going to be talking today about the route from clinical trials to clinical practice and mapping the next steps for psychedelic research and development. Now, I'm coming from industry, and I'm going to be talking particularly on the development side of things, applied research, how we get these treatments into patients' hands following approval, and as many hands as possible. I'm not going to be dealing with the leading edge of academic research in this space. What we can learn about consciousness or deep mechanistic studies or particularly fluoride trial designs. That's not what I'm going to be covering today because it's not what my area of expertise is. So, first, for anyone not so familiar with Clerkenwell and what we do, I'll just give a quick background to the company and our activities, how we got here and why we're doing it, and what were our motivations for setting up the company in one of the most complex regulatory areas that we could hope to find. Then, for anyone not close to the burgeoning psychedelics industry, I'll give a brief overview of the state of the sector, how many companies, and where we're at. Then I want to spend a bit of time discussing Lykos Therapeutics, and in particular their rejection of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD by the FDA last year. And then I'm going to take us on a fairly whistle-stop tour, and definitely non-exhaustive tour, of some of the big challenges facing the sector post-approval that will need to be tackled in order for these treatments to be widely accessible and normalized, demonstrating value for money, regulating the psychotherapeutic component, and real-world patient cohorts.
Just want to share slides from Zoom. That's my bad. Sorry, everyone. Share. Can you see that?
So, Clerkenwell Heath. We've got a Clerkenwell employee here today. So, Simon is our senior psychiatrist, as well as also being a member of your faculty. So, that's one of his many hats that he wears, but we're very grateful to have him wearing one of ours. So, we're a clinical research organisation and site network focusing on psychiatry and CNS trials with a core specialism in trials with psychedelics. And we founded Clerkenwell just nearly 5 years ago during the initial explosion in commercial interest in clinical development of psychedelics. While our focus has since expanded to also focus on other areas of psychiatric and CNS clinical development, our original aim and core competency has always been on improving the provision and delivery of clinical research with psychedelics. So we saw 4 areas that were really affecting trials in this space. Lack of appropriate trial sites, so their setting wasn't necessarily appropriate for psychedelic trials in particular, and often wider psychiatry trials. Academic centres or hospitals particularly stretched for resource. Contracting and site setup can often be slow. Slow participant recruitment, so this isn't an issue just in psychedelic trials, but it does apply to them equally. So access to patient pools is often limited and hard to reach. And inclusion exclusion criteria for trials aren't often that well thought out. It's one of the biggest issues when you're designing trials is actually getting them right so you can recruit a population that exists as opposed to an idealized population. So that's something that we inform on the CRO side of our business. And then innovation in recruitment is often lacking. So a lot of the large CROs have very traditional approaches to recruitment. Inconsistent delivery between sites. This is obviously particularly relevant when you're delivering larger phase 3 trials. But variability in site performance can lead to delays and jeopardizes the trial integrity. Inconsistent adherence to protocols impacts data reliability. And lastly, limited experience within CROs themselves. Certainly at the time when we set that up, there's been more of an incursion into the space now. But the kind of standard cookie cutter trial models that they were used to kind of applying pretty much indiscriminately across different areas of medicine were certainly not applicable within psychedelic trials, and often not within other areas of psychiatry. So designing practical, approvable, and mostly efficient studies can be very challenging. But also kind of, I guess, more loftily, our longer term goal has really been to tackle access to these treatments following approval. So this was always our kind of long-term view. There can be a disconnect between commercial developers in this space and kind of academic researchers that might be having that kind of longer-term view. And what we hope to do is find opportunities to find the common ground between both and identify the gaps in research that would need to be plugged for these treatments to be administered, widespread throughout and adopted throughout the NHS. So we set up Clerkenwell to attempt to address these issues. We are, to use the industry terms, a combined CRO, so contract research organisation, and SMO, site management organisation. This is a relatively rare business model for companies delivering trials before phase 1, certainly in the UK. Typically, phase 1 units will take on both activities when they're running very small, very contained healthy volunteer studies. But then as you move through to later stages of development, this combined approach is seen less often. We wanted to bring these two back together because by doing that and learning from each other inside one company, we can effectively address those challenges that we're facing psychedelic and wider psychiatry clinical trials. Both can also act independently, both sides of the business. So we provide CRO services to trials running at other sites, and we act as sites for trials that are managed by external CROs. We operate on trials from phase 1 through to phase 3, although the majority of our work tends to fall within phases 2 and 3, so in clinical cohorts. So what do we do? On the CRO side, we offer clinical development advice, so regulatory engagement, clinical trial design services, including submission of clinical trial applications, as well as management and monitoring of trials during delivery. On the site side of things, we deliver trials themselves, including all the typical trial delivery activities of screening, dosing, prep, and integration sessions, and then follow-up visits. We also have a healthcare practitioner training program. So we launched the Foundations program publicly early last year, I think, and we'll be launching the skills-based stage of that program in the first half of 2026. If anyone's been wondering about it, because we said we were going to launch it this year, we delayed it because of kind of delays in other areas of the sector, but it is coming next year. Besides this, we've developed a number of academic collaborations, allowing us to connect some of the insights we could pick up running commercial trials to academic efforts to develop these treatments into feasible healthcare interventions. Our site network is now growing. So our first 2 sites are based in London, and just last month we opened our 3rd site in Doncaster, Yorkshire. We have plans to open 2 more sites, 2 more UK sites in 2026, which will allow us to recruit to our trials from a much wider patient pool. The benefit of having a network is obviously this addresses the issue of variable performance and experience across sites, so there can be far more knowledge sharing throughout these sites. And we can centralize management, standardize processes, and ensure consistent high-quality delivery across all our sites. And that's particularly important where we're doing challenging things like managing controlled drugs licensing. So this allows us to have an efficient and joint approach to some of the more specific operational challenges posed by these trials. So provision of therapists and independent raters, and experience, like I said, with controlled drugs licensing. This has also allowed us to set up sites at speed. So from commencement of site setup to receipt of our Home Office license, our last 2 sites took 8 and 11 months to set up respectively. Here are our trial sites themselves. So our Welbeck site has been operational for nearly 3 years. and was very much our proof of concept. It only has 3 rooms. Our Baker Street site has been open for nearly a year, and of course, Doncaster I've just mentioned. All hold Schedule 1 licenses. We actually got the one for Doncaster through last week, and we've vetted a vetted patient database of over 50,000 patients. Access say to 6 PIs. It's more than PIs now. It just says 6 on my screen. So access to multiple PIs and a wider clinical team, including over 40 therapists. We operate at speed to ensure we can meet commercial timelines and targets. We've completed, or we have 13 trials either completed or currently active, 11 of which were with psychedelics, and we've contributed to a further 13 trials in some way or another with either design or recruitment activities. And we've dispensed over 200 doses. I don't know what the most recent figure is for that. It might be a bit higher now. The most recent site is also a UK first partnership between a private research company, ourselves, and an NHS Foundation Trust. So this allows us to bring together the benefits of both organisations. It's a model we're planning on replicating in our next 2 sites, and in particular those benefits. So that kind of speed and laser focus on delivery, that's something that we can bring. But then things like recruitment from the surrounding NHS Foundation Trust and bring in kind of wider community is something that then comes from that partnership. So just another touch point on is the patient journey. So we've built our sites to offer a very non-clinical feel, as you can see here, with setting in mind and incorporating biophilic design throughout. But really, this is just a slide. It's just an excuse to show some nice pictures of what we're doing. So, the state of the sector. Where do we stand with commercial psychedelic drug development? And literally the multi-million-dollar question, how far away is approval? So, in the grand scheme of things, in wider biotech, this is still a relatively young sector. While there's a few companies, so small pharma, which are now Cybin, MAPS, Lykos, and Compass, so they were well into their development programs before 2020. The majority of companies in this space have only been founded within the last 5 years. And in that time, we've seen significant proliferation of new companies and then subsequent consolidation as most of them went bust and had to sold to others. So this is where we're at now. So thanks very much here to Psychedelic Alpha for doing the hard work for me. This bullseye chart that they produce every year shows all the publicly visible companies developing psychedelic drugs. In total, that's well over 80. Although it's worth clarifying that the majority of these are still at a relatively early stage of development. A lot of them in preclinical or just starting to plan their phase 1. And there's quite a substantial gap in between the financing between the biggest 6 or so companies that are now in phase 3 or entering phase 3 and the rest. Although even by big pharma standards, the likes of Compass Pathways is still a relatively small biotech. So taking into account attrition, we can expect to see in the region of probably 70 clinical trials taking place within the next 5 years. And certainly it's our hope that as many as possible come to the UK. So excitingly, a number of programs are now in phase 3, which is obviously a major milestone. The current count of ongoing phase 3 programs is 7, and that includes the Solvonis Therapeutics trial, which is the More Care trial, being run by Exeter at the bottom, with at least an additional 5 more phase 3 trials set to start later this year or early next, and certainly Clerkenwell are involved in a number of them. The majority of these are focusing on major or treatment-resistant depression, although, as you can see, there's also PTSD, generalized anxiety, and alcohol use disorders. These companies are now starting to think about the next steps and market access, mainly with a focus on the US. So Compass Pathways in particular has started working with a network of partner sites to start mapping what access might look like in approval. However, last year saw a significant setback. The FDA's recent rejection of Lykos Therapeutics MDMA-assisted therapy application was a wake-up call for the industry, and that's what I'm going to speak on next. So Lykos' experience last year with the FDA's rejection of MDMA-assisted therapy provides a useful example of the abundant regulatory challenges the sector faces. I won't dwell on the full details or blow-by-blow account of the events, but crucially, the FDA highlighted a number of issues with data as they saw it. Methodological issues, including issues with blinding and expectancy, and controls around the psychological intervention, which I'll say a little bit more on. Some specific pieces of missing data they highlighted as well, and also perceived misconduct both from therapists and from the central research team. So I'm not going to unpack every single one of these pieces, but I'm going to focus on a few elements in particular that have drawn wider industry attention following the decision. First, blinding and expectancy. Partly I'm mentioning this just so that I have an excuse to put that cartoon in another talk. I try and fit it in every single one. My favorite. It's well known that blinding and expectancy are almost insoluble issues within psychedelic trials. Plenty has been said and published about how these issues should be addressed, so I'm not going to go through the kind of academic workings there. There was a feeling by some in the industry that this issue was so obvious and insurmountable that regulators would, to some extent, have to overlook it or just accept it. However, we saw with Lycos, I mean, possibly as a cover-up due to the wealth of other issues raised in their application, that there were concerns raised in relation to this. And an openness to these issues is essential when interpreting the trial data, but there are operational and design tools that can be used to reduce their impact, which Lycos haven't necessarily taken into account of. So using independent raters, carefully managing expectations and patient-facing language, and using technology to monitor for functional unblinding. Additionally, one of the approaches that the FDA has kind of championed is using low and medium dose comparators as opposed to just a non-active placebo can help address this. And that three-arm design, like I say, it's been recommended by the FDA as one of their preferred solutions, and it's now been taken up by a number of companies entering phase 3. Certainly, it's one of the design that Compass used for one of their phase 3s. The psychotherapeutic intervention. So this is really one of the trickiest questions that the FDA raised, and that companies have been reflecting on subsequently. How to account for and measure the impact of the psychotherapeutic component. Therapist selection, training and monitoring is core to this, and we've adopted the use of AI monitoring tools that allow analysis of therapy. Well, companies have. We're starting to see it come through in trials. The use of AI monitoring tools that allow analysis of therapist fidelity, functional blinding, etc. And these review the therapy sessions and can provide feedback to the therapist for training purposes, or can monitor to give a quantitative measure of things like fidelity to the therapy training manual. However, it's worth noting that these attempts to monitor, if not employed carefully and with consideration to the very human dynamic that is created in the treatment room, could impact the delivery of the therapeutic component itself. So I was on a panel earlier this year with a therapist who has worked on many trials, including some of ours, and he gave an account from his therapist perspective of attempting to provide therapy within the limitations that psychedelic clinical trials, and especially commercial psychedelic clinical trials, put on them. So attempting to hold space and create a rapport when every word is being monitored by AI, and constant interruptions for physical assessments or patient-reported outcomes are required. And these trials don't give therapists an easy task. So attempts to measure this aspect of the intervention does need to be built in with their kind of understanding and consent, how to do so kind of tactfully, with input from the therapists themselves. There are now plans to start to utilize this monitoring during clinical practice post-approval. So it's really important at this stage that we understand how that needs to be done carefully, so it's not reducing the therapeutic impact and guarding against tech overreach that could impact on these outcomes. So how has the industry reacted, actually? The FDA advisory committee decision has largely been interpreted two ways across the sector. So some developers felt that the rejection was really a criticism of Lykos's specific development program and some of the decisions they made and their oversight, its shortcomings in design and integrity. I think others have taken a different perspective. So they argue that MAPS and Lykos were simply unlucky to be the first to face regulatory review. Since 2018, the regulator's understanding of psychedelic therapeutics has evolved considerably. You can now have a fairly informed conversation with regulators at the FDA about psychedelics, whereas certainly a few years ago that would have been completely impossible. And the standards they expect, consequently, in 2025 are far higher than when these trials were first designed and advice was first sought by MAPS. As a whole, the view is still very much that the underlying science and potential of the field remain intact with regulators, rather than a verdict on psychedelic-assisted therapy as a whole. What's followed is a clear split in the field. So some companies are minimizing the psychotherapy element and trying to demonstrate the drug effect with as little psychological support as possible, and employing semantic workarounds to avoid mentioning therapy or therapists at any cost in their training manuals, or really in any of their documentation. So facilitators and dosing session monitors are all kind of the terms that they use, psychological support, instead of actually just calling it therapy, despite the fact that they're all trained therapists usually. So others are leaning into the therapeutic component and seeking ways to standardize and strengthen it to show how drug and therapy work synergistically. There's been an assertion from some that this is a temporary measure to achieve. There's been an assertion from some that this is a temporary measure, so that the reducing of the psychotherapy component is a temporary measure to achieve approval. And after this, when it's in clinical practice, then the therapy can be dialed back up. But there's clearly the risk that once it is removed and the intervention is approved, that defending it, then once it's removed, it'll be hard to add it back in. And so defending it at this stage, I think, is important, so that it can be reintroduced in an effective way. So what we're really seeing is not just a race about who gets to approval first, it's also a battle of ideas about what psychedelic-assisted therapy should look like, and the outcome of that debate will shape the future of the sector. So hopefully that gives you an idea of where the industry is at now, at least broadly. I now like to look forward to what's coming next. We'll soon be reaching a critical transition point, so how we take what we've learned in clinical research and apply it to day-to-day healthcare, which will be a really dramatic shift. So commercial development of psychedelics, what we've got right and what's still missing. When we look at commercial development of psychedelics, there are a number of things the sector has done very well, but also some major gaps that the industry hasn't yet tackled or truly engaged with. So what we've got right, first, we now have a solid and reliable body of safety data, and growing. That's crucial. Regulators need confidence that these compounds can be used responsibly and safely in clinical settings, although the thorny issue of what constitutes an adverse event in an acute psychedelic experience is still very much a live debate. And secondly, developers have engaged with regulators and worked closely with their expectations for demonstrating efficacy. So this is to be expected and charts an expected route within wider biotech. Third, there's been a strong emphasis on targeting large, clearly defined patient populations with unmet needs. So, for example, treatment-resistant depression or severe PTSD. So that regulators can evaluate these treatments clearly within their own frameworks. And fourth, we've seen efficiencies in intervention delivery, training, monitoring, and infrastructure, which has helped clarify the picture of what these treatments might look like in clinical practice. And finally, a growing evidence base is being created that healthcare professionals can start to trust. So that's vital for the eventual uptake into mainstream care, where these treatments still carry significant stigma and misunderstanding. The rather weak call a couple of weeks ago from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, I think, is testament to this. There's still a lot of nervousness around. It wasn't, nailing their colours to the mast, as some people would have liked. What's still missing? There are also some critical gaps. So, one is that our psychiatric disease categories may not be the best fit for psychiatry and treatment as a whole, but may not be the best fit for psychedelics. These drugs often act transdiagnostically, and so rigid DSM categories may limit how we design trials and evaluate the outcomes. And tackling that obviously goes beyond the purview of any individual drug developer. It would be nice if the industry as a whole could start to at least acknowledge that it's an issue. Another big challenge is defining psychedelic-assisted therapy as a combined intervention, meaning the drug and psychotherapy together, not one or the other. So I've already mentioned the drive to minimize the therapeutic component rather than defining these treatments as multi-component. We also lack consensus on the minimum safety and efficacy thresholds that should be set for the psychotherapy component. How much therapy is enough? What level of training and supervision should be required? These are still currently unanswered questions. And from a policy perspective, there's still work to be done to demonstrate cost effectiveness compared to standard of care. Without that, reimbursement and widespread adoption, such as in the NHS, will be limited. And finally, the field has been cautious about engaging with the difficult mechanistic questions, like how exactly psychedelics and psychotherapy interact, and how those mechanisms translate into long-term clinical practice, leaving this to their academic counterparts. And without that deeper understanding from the industry, who will ultimately be bringing these things to market, scaling up may run into challenges when there isn't that kind of deep understanding of the entire intervention. So while the sector has made some enormous progress in laying the foundations, we still have some big conceptual, regulatory, and economic questions to answer before psychedelics can truly become part of routine care. So there are a whole host of issues we could go into here, so from clinical research to clinical practice. But I'm going to focus on three of the most relevant and hopefully interesting. Each of these could fill a lecture all on its own, so I'm going to be keeping things relatively high level. And we can then go back into more depth on any one of them with questions afterwards. The psychotherapy component, these are all mixed up. Demonstrating value for money. So not just proving efficacy, but proving cost effectiveness to healthcare systems. The psychotherapy component, how we optimize it, overcome regulatory barriers, and eventually create a framework for accreditation. And real-world patient cohorts, so moving behind those carefully selected trial populations to those with comorbidities, complex presentations, and diverse needs. Each of these areas is crucial if psychedelic therapies are going to succeed and flourish outside of the trial environment. So, demonstrating value for money for these treatments. Whenever a new treatment comes to market, it has to go through what's known as a health technology assessment, or HTA. This is essentially the process that determines whether a health system believes the treatment is worth the investment. For psychedelics, HTA poses some unique challenges. The first is the high upfront costs. So it's not just the drugs themselves, but we're talking about drugs that have just undergone full phase of development. That's a huge investment from these drug companies that they need to recoup from the cost of the drug, and they're obviously patented drugs themselves. So even though, in principle, generic drugs could be created very cheaply, at least initially, while those patents are still in place, the drugs will still remain expensive. But then also alongside that, there's the need for specially trained therapists and clinicians, extended therapy sessions themselves, and clinical oversight, and that adds up quickly. On top of that, when you compare psychedelics to the existing standard of care, so a packet of SSRIs, which costs pennies, they can look disproportionately expensive. Infrastructure is another hurdle. So you need dedicated treatment spaces and significant staffing, which many services simply don't have in place. And finally, there are methodological issues. So HTA frameworks are not necessarily designed to capture indirect benefits from treatments, or they're not necessarily well suited to evaluate complex combined interventions involving a course of therapy and a limited limited time drug intervention. But there's not just challenges, there's also a lot of opportunities here as well. So psychedelics have the potential to deliver substantial improvements in well-being and overall quality of life. If those improvements are durable, they may act to reduce long-term healthcare use and saving money down the line to public health. In many cases, there is expectation that psychedelics will prove to be clinically superior to current options, with better remission rates and reduced relapse rates, which makes a compelling argument in and of itself. There's the upcoming Dimension trial led by the Mind Foundation in Germany in collaboration with USONA is due to start in 2026, and that's going to be particularly important in answering some of these questions. So it's really going to be the first large-scale psychedelic trial where answering questions regarding economic feasibility of psilocybin-assisted therapy in particular, compared to standard care, are central. There have been health economic measures, certainly in a number of the phase 3s ongoing and upcoming, but this is really going to be the first one where they're trying ultimately to answer that question, like can we prove that it is value for money? And it means it won't just be testing efficacy and safety, but it's also whether these treatments can make economic sense within healthcare systems. And that's a critical piece of the puzzle if we want to see these therapies adopted at scale. There's a huge amount more that can be said on this topic alone, although it can get into rather dry regulatory territory. So I'm going to stop here with this one. Although for anyone that is interested, I'd highly recommend the report Reimbursement Pathways for Psychedelic Therapies in Europe by Gisbio Hall. For anyone that is interested, it's a hoot. It is very good. Sorry. Right. The psychotherapeutic component. There's still a huge amount to be done here with regards to iteration and optimization of the very many variables that can exist around psychotherapy. In the rush to demonstrate efficacy of the drugs, a kind of minimum viable product of psychotherapy has been left to emerge from many of the trials. And this obviously presents a huge opportunity for research, but I'm going to leave that to the side and focus on that to one side and focus on the slightly stickier issue of regulation, which is a question both the industry and wider healthcare sector needs to be able to provide an answer to allow widespread rollout of these interventions. So one of the biggest challenges for psychedelic-assisted therapy is not the drug itself, but the psychotherapeutic component. Unlike traditional, biggest challenges for regulation, actually. Unlike traditional pharmaceutical interventions, where the pill is the intervention here, we're dealing with a combined treatment, a drug plus therapy, and that raises a fundamental regulatory question. How will this be regulated following approval of these interventions? And certainly, the drug regulators have answered that very clearly. It's not going to be them. So it's not going to be the MHRA, it's not going to be the FDA, and it's not going to be the EMA saying this is how therapists should be regulated. They might have some opinions on it, but they're certainly not going to be responsible for conducting that regulation. So at Clerkenwell, we've been working with King's College London to map out the broad barriers and facilitators to this process. So what's clear is that the issue goes far beyond clinical research itself. Of course, we need more trial designs, more consistent therapist training. But what we also need to think about is the external environment beyond these trials. So the bioethical considerations, socio-political context, and the position of professional bodies. For example, regulatory organisations for psychotherapy, so BACP or BPS in the UK, have so far been reluctant to engage with this issue. When there have been attempts to engage in their position is that until the drugs are approved and until there is a stronger evidence base for what the common therapeutic factors actually are, they don't want to take a formal stance. They also want clarity on the ethical dimensions of psychedelic therapy before committing to regulation. And this obviously is going to create a gap. On the one hand, regulators of medicines will expect the psychotherapeutic element to be defined, standardized, and regulated. On the other hand, psychotherapy regulators are holding back until that process has already advanced. So we end up with somewhat of a chicken and egg problem here. Fortunately, we're working on creating an egg. So we have. So one route forward is to create a clear accreditation framework that can be adopted once drug approvals are in place. But for that to happen, we need to first agree on what exactly we mean by the psychotherapeutic component of psychedelic-assisted therapy. And right now, definitions vary widely. So in some trials, psychedelic therapy is described as a psychotherapeutic intervention with a clear modality, such as CBT or ACT. And in others, it's simply a program of preparatory and integration sessions without specifying a psychotherapeutic model. Sometimes it's just described in terms of the therapist's adherence to a loose set of principles, and that lack of clarity makes regulation almost impossible at this stage. What we need instead is a layered framework that covers first the overall treatment model. So is psychedelic-assisted therapy being defined as its own intervention or as an augmentation of an existing one? Second, the structure of the program itself. How many sessions, what type, and with what therapeutic aim? Third, therapist training and supervision. So not just initial training, but ongoing assessment of competence and fidelity. And finally, the evaluation framework itself. So how do we measure whether the psychotherapeutic component has been delivered consistently and safely across a network or the entire NHS? The good news is that the wider psychotherapy literature already gives us some tools there. So there's existing evaluation methods and accreditation systems for therapy modalities that we can draw from. The challenge is adapting them to the unique context of psychedelic treatment. At Clerkenwell, we're collaborating with the University of Roehampton on precisely this task. So our goal to map an accreditation framework that could quickly be adopted wholesale by regulators once drug approvals are granted. And we're in late stages of applying for funding with Innovate UK to support this work further. And ultimately, the end goal is straightforward: to ensure that when psychedelic therapies are rolled out in clinical practice, the psychotherapeutic component is clearly defined, consistently delivered, and regulated in a way that protects patients and supports practitioners, and allows for sufficient flexibility, improvement, and innovation. This would create a solid basis for training on a national scale, which will soon be needed, I hope. We're at 45 minutes in. Do you want me to go on with the last bit of the presentation a bit longer, or do we want to start? Yeah?
I've got an hour and a half.
The last bit, it starts getting a bit more fun.
Well, you can stop if you want.
Real world cohorts. Here we are. So, the challenges with real world cohorts. So, moving into clinical practice means engaging with patients who are much more complex than trial cohorts. That includes people with multiple diagnoses, severe presentations, vulnerable adults and adolescents, and those with unstable life circumstances, to name but a few of the challenges that I'm going to mention here. We also need to think about longer-term treatment plans, inpatient care, and integration with broader services, which are not issues that industry-led trials typically address. These challenges are also opportunities. If we can design interventions and training that meet these needs, either for investigation through clinical research or in real-world data collection of psychedelics in clinical practice, we have the potential to fill gaps in mental health care that are otherwise currently neglected. So it's quite an exciting potential we're looking at. So I've got 5 different examples that I'm just going to kind of work through to kind of give very different perspectives on some of the things we might want to work at. Real world cohorts. First one is women. So one striking and particularly egregious example is how these trials have historically excluded women not on hormonal contraception, because natural cycles are seen as a confound, and also due to issues around safety if certain safety studies haven't been done. Although in practice, women with varying hormonal profiles will absolutely be treated. And for the kind of basis of this slide, I'm very much kind of indebted to Hysterica, who they've made this their kind of mission to focus on. So this is obviously not just an issue within psychedelic trials, but the rapid acting nature and single dosing schedule makes this as a particularly notable issue in relation to these treatments. So obviously, depending on where in your monthly cycle you take the dose or report the effects of the dose, it's going to vary significantly based on the impact of hormones and the interaction between the hormones and the drugs themselves. So emerging evidence suggests that ovarian hormone fluctuations can significantly influence both the acute psychedelic experience and long-term outcomes. And we need either dedicated trials to investigate these relationships or dedicated real-world evidence collection to design protocols and interventions that account for them in clinical practice. So Clerkenwell is already supporting work in this space to help close this gap. There's a paper that was published earlier this year by Cohen and Blessed Hopley from Hysterica, which kind of mapped out the problem, and we're now taking that a step further to kind of offer up a detailed kind of methodology and kind of methods approach, both to how to conduct trials to address this kind of research question and knowledge gap, but also for regulators so that they can become more comfortable with the idea that we need to do this research. A second example is comorbidities. So most commercial clinical trials recruit clean cohorts, excluding patients with overlapping conditions. But in reality, comorbidities are the rule, not the exception. Anxiety and depression, for example, often co-occur. Dual diagnosis with addiction are common, and many excluded groups like bipolar, psychosis, and personality disorders may still be wondering if these treatments could be relevant for them. Some risks are obviously very well documented. So, for example, psychedelics can exacerbate mania in bipolar disorder. But I think an interesting piece that seems to be emerging from more recent evidence is that the kind of previously well-founded assumption that psychedelics exacerbate psychosis uniformly seems to be actually far less well evidenced now that we're actually getting to later stages of things. And in fact, from naturalistic data that's been collected by researchers, there seems to be evidence that for people with a psychosis diagnosis but concurrent depression, it's actually one of the most effective ways they found of managing their depression without it exacerbating their psychosis symptoms. This is obviously something that commercial clinical trials that uniformly exclude these groups haven't been measuring at all currently. So with the right safeguards in place and incredibly carefully designed trials, we may be able to extend treatment safely to these excluded groups. But the research needs to come first here to allow that. If we start doing that work in clinical practice without the sufficient safeguards, that's where we run the risk of running into some serious issues. So some researchers need to start exploring this area before the treatment gets ahead of them, essentially. So in one area, at least, we're starting to do this. So we're working with the University of Roehampton to develop specific training modules to address dual diagnosis in particular, which no trials to date have actually tackled. So we received Innovate funding for this piece of work. And the end goal is, once we develop this training module, we'll then be taking that forwards and applying for funding to run a pilot program where we can investigate dual diagnosis with a psychedelic-assisted therapy. Severe presentation. So this, I think, is a really interesting and very overlooked area with psychedelics. So severe cases like borderline personality disorder, complex PTSD, or high comorbidity patients have been so far completely avoided in trials. Partly that's due to the safety, partly it's also due to the industry taking a very risk-averse approach to these groups. If you run a trial, especially in, for example, a trial in borderline personality disorder, you can expect a high number of adverse events and serious adverse events. And typically, a drug development company doesn't want to expose themselves by doing a trial of that risk. But these patients carry a huge burden. So they account for long inpatient stays, heavy service use, and very high suicide rates. So I think the figure is 1 in 10 patients with borderline personality disorder will die by suicide. Treating them will require a very different approach to the trials that are being conducted at the moment. So much longer trials, an integrated care plan that might last months, and very careful risk management and mitigation. But the potential to public health itself is huge. That may not be attractive for commercial developers, as I mentioned, because these trials are going to be costly. But for health systems stand to gain hugely in savings and patients' outcomes. So something that I'm really hoping will happen as these trials reach approval or get approved is funders like the NMHR will start to take notice of their potential in these groups and start to look at initially just the smallest pilots of what could be done here and assessing primarily, is it possible, before then developing the most effective treatments. So it's something that we've been kind of looking at for a while because we think it's an interested and kind of very needed area. It's something that we've been kind of actively drafting proposals in this space. We're looking for academic collaborators currently to take this forward. If anyone's interested. Nearly there. So, vulnerable adults. Another group to anticipate are vulnerable adults, such as survivors of intimate partner violence. So this is one particular group that we've taken special interest in. These individuals often face heightened safety risk and external safety risk, and interventions would need to be very carefully adapted to account for these. So, for example, ensuring that therapy doesn't inadvertently increase risk by prompting premature confrontation or return to their abusers. If properly adapted, psychedelic-assisted therapy could not only improve mental health outcomes, but we have a kind of working theory based on some case study kind of data that not only could mental health outcomes be improved, but also indirect risks could potentially be addressed. So if you could develop an intervention that might help support a survivor's level of resilience and self-efficacy, that might lower their risk of returning to an abusive relationship. And the benefit of a psychedelic-assisted therapy intervention in this instance is that it's very rapid acting. So you can intervene in a period where they need the most help quickly to remove themselves or support with removing themselves from a dangerous situation. So we're currently working on a project here with collaborators at Bristol and Cambridge to incorporate this idea. So we're currently in the midst of a literature review, conducting some PPI input Facebook groups, focus groups. Oh my god! And conducting some service provider engagement. That's something that's not been done yet. So going to refugees and actually asking people there if they've even heard about psychedelic therapy and what their views are, so that we can develop an adapted intervention that takes account of some of these specific challenges that this group presents with. And the aim again is to apply for future funding to do a pilot trial in this space. And then lastly, so the final group that I wanted to mention is adolescents. So I think there's maybe this kind of view that these treatments won't go there for whatever reasons, that the regulators will insist on this being an adult-only intervention. That's definitely not going to be the case. So there's actually a kind of regulatory requirement once you've developed a kind of successful therapy for adults, where if there's a compelling mechanism why it might work in pediatric populations, to investigate that. And I've heard it first-hand from regulators when we've been in conversations with them. In particular, this was in relation to a developer developing a smoking cessation intervention, and they were specifically mentioning that they were only going to be targeting adults, and immediately the MHRA kind of fired back with, but that's not where this intervention needs to be. This intervention needs to be enacted between the ages of 16 and 18. That's when most people start smoking, and if you can intervene then you have the best chance of remission. So these interventions will go there. This group obviously poses some pretty unique challenges in relation to psychedelic-assisted therapy. So obviously safety data will be the first thing that regulators want to see. Is it actually safe for younger developing brains? But there's actually kind of wider environmental factors which should be taken into account as well. And I'm indebted to Eddie Jacobs and his work in this space for kind of laying out these ideas. But the environmental factors such as reduced autonomy and kind of constant exposure to the kind of stresses that a teen, happen in everyday teen life, are kind of constant pressure and something that is their environment going into a psychedelic-assisted intervention. So an intriguing possibility is that psychedelics could be utilized not necessarily on the adolescent themselves, but that a family-centered approach could be taken in this regard. So the problem might not lie with the adolescent. There might be someone in their family causing some of this grief, and taking a kind of wider kind of family therapy-centric kind of view to this might be a better approach to how this intervention could be delivered to help treat an adolescent suffering from treatment-resistant depression, for example. So summary. What's next for psychedelic R&D? So there will be lots more trials and larger ones, but increasingly they will need to start developing some of these aspects that I've mentioned that readies these treatments for things like HTA review. Those big challenges are going to need to be confronted, so proving value for money and translating these trials into practice. We will need to establish how we're going to regulate and standardize the psychotherapy component. And lastly, we're going to need to adapt these interventions for real-world cohorts with complex and diverse needs. If we can achieve this, we'll move from promising clinical data to adoption of genuinely transformative treatments.